Good afternoon, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf. It's Christmas Eve and I have come back to Brighton to see my family again. So previously on this channel we have had my brother Alfred talking about the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and we have had my mother Roz talking about her mother's experiences in the Second World War. And today I thought it was high time that my dad made an appearance. So this is Steve.
Hello.
I've dragged him away from listening to his King Crimson CD. The vinyl.
Proper record.
Yeah. In order to talk about another shade of red. So the one book that we have both read recently is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So I read The Scarlet Letter as part of a read-along that was organised by Kelly from Books I'm Not Reading. And Steve read it.
Well, I'm trying to read a classic novel every month as part of my own personal reading challenge. And in November I finally managed to read Moby Dick, and I was so enamoured with the mid-19th century American style of writing that I decided that I had to have some more of it. And
yes.
I'd heard you and Roz talking about the Scarlet Letter, so I thought I'd give it a go.
Yeah. And it's interesting actually because Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, how do you say his name?
Melville. Mieville's a different writer altogether.
Oh, is he?
Yeah, it's a China Mieville, much more modern.
Yes, that's true. That's why I was confused.
Yeah.
So Nathaniel and Hawthorne and... Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville were friends, and I think Melville was like a defender of Hawthorne's writing style at times.
Uh-huh.
But the actual... I mean, I've not read Moby Dick, but would you say that the style is quite different?
Yeah, I think so. Melville is writing in character, I think, a lot of the time. So the way I got through Moby Dick was to imagine I was trapped in a bar in Nantucket one winter and was being told this story by an old whaler in the corner somewhere. Whereas I think Hawthorne is a bit more, he's got that more of an authorial voice.
Yeah.
He's like a historian, because effectively it is a historical novel.
Yes.
Written in 1850 about...
1650? About 1650.
Yeah, 200
so
years.
Early settlers to what was to become the United States. And I think most of the people in the town where this is set weren't born there. So like Hester and Arthur Dimmesdale and Roger Chillingworth, they all came over to this town by boat at some point.
Sort of like immigrants, really.
Yeah.
There's probably some sort of caravan or flotilla that came across from Europe with a lot of refugees who were fleeing,
religious refugees.
Religious persecution, who wound up in America.
And began persecuting each other.
Shh.
Yeah, so Hawthorne's got more of the kind of like omniscient narrator type voice. And what struck me about the style of this book was I read it in November, shortly after October, which... What?
Yeah, November, usually shortly after October.
So I read this shortly after reading books like Silas Marner by George Eliot and Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. So I found that it was very reminiscent of that, and that it was a very Victorian feeling book despite being American, so not technically Victorian, but it had the same kind of feelings of fate playing quite a large role, the same kind of important centrality of ideas of religion and morality, sort of social position.
I think that's true. I think it's a Europe-facing book. That's what it struck me as compared to Melville.
Yeah.
Was that Melville is very much an American book, set in America, about an American industry at that time, which was quite significant.
What?
And hello, Alf.
Carry on. You were saying something thoughtful and intelligent.
I'm saying something thoughtful and intelligent, which is a change. I haven't read Dickens this year, but I did also read Silas Marner, and I think that there is that similarity in terms of a more European sensibility in George Eliot's writing and Hawthorne's, whereas, as I say, Melville, it seems much more American in his focus.
And it's interesting in the book, there's various moments where Hester kind of looks back towards Europe as both the solution and also the cause of the problems. Like, it's her relationship with Chillingworth in Europe that causes some of the problems for her when she comes over, but it's also when she is the one moment in the book that has any kind of hope to it, when she and Arthur are sort of contemplating their options. They say that they want to go back to Europe. So it's kind of like the role that Europe plays as this kind of alternative past world where things are done slightly differently.
Well, it very much mirrors that, doesn't it? It's the old world and the new world. You've got her husband Chillingworth, who is old and represents the old world, and then she is in the new world, although of the old world to a certain extent, and is being punished for her new ideas or a new way of living.
I should say that this is a spoilery review. I know, yeah.
Well, it's fairly central, really, isn't it? The
Yeah.
whole idea of the Scarlet Letter. It's sort of like the title, bit of a giveaway. But...
And I was saying to you yesterday, the other book that I'm reading at the moment is The Righteous Mind, and that talks about like the development of sort of different moral systems, and it talks about sort of group-based morality versus what we in sort of Western society have now tends to be a sort of individualistic morality. And I guess you can see Hester as being the example of individualistic morality. There's even a point where it says that because she'd been living on her own, because she'd been so ostracised from society and the moral influences of the group, she'd begun to sort of process her own ideas differently and distinctively, and thus begins to be this kind of individualistic moral character, as opposed to Arthur Dimmesdale, who's still very embedded in the group. He still kind of holds the group moral values as being central to him.
Well, there's a very strong part to play in that as the priest or the vicar of that community.
He's supposed to be the upholder of the moral system.
Well, I think you're right. It is that Hester does represent a new way or a new world, or having to make a new way in a new world. As it were, and to have to create a different morality for different times and different circumstances. And I think that Hawthorne is very much emphasising that as a transition between the old world and the new world, which I think is interesting. He is, as you say, is historical, so he's looking back as a foundation myth almost about where those ideas may have come from.
What would you say is the role of Pearl in that? Because for much of the book, Pearl is almost slightly demonic. If Hester's like the start of a new moral approach, if the offspring of that new moral approach is this slightly wild and uncontrollable child, does that reflect Hawthorne disapproving of?
No, I don't think so. I saw Pearl as playing a different role in the book, as being much more a manifestation of nature, which I think is another important theme for me in the book, was the whole idea of the natural world, an almost paganistic kind of view of things. And I think Pearl very much represents that sort of freedom, that untrammelled. Yeah, although she has got some constraints placed upon her. The fact that she lives slightly outside the rest of the community and gives her a degree of freedom which other children wouldn't have. And she gets to wear different clothes and to play on the beach and is left to her own devices.
I was thinking of that scene actually. There's a couple of really beautiful scenes where Hawthorne spends a lot of time dedicated to just describing Pearl interacting with natural scenery, like when they're in the forest as well. And her on the beach where she's just kind of figuring out her place in the natural system. So I think she's throwing stones at the seagulls, and then she sort of realises that she shouldn't be throwing stones at the seagulls. So she kind of is teaching herself her own way of existence.
And then she drapes herself with seaweed, doesn't she? Which is almost like becoming some kind of part sea creature. Sea goddess, maybe, or sea nymph or something.
No, Pearl's a very interesting and mixed figure. I think one of the things I tried to do was I wanted to read some essays on the Scarlet Letter. I started reading some essays on the Scarlet Letter and realised that there is a reason why I didn't study English literature. But one of the things that I noticed was that Pearl is such a sort of a controversial character that people have seemed to manage to interpret in manifold ways. She's quite hard to pin down. She's got a lot of different things going on with her.
Well, I think that was deliberate. I think that was possibly also Hawthorne commenting on nature being hard to pin down, and that actually best laid plans, as it were. Human beings can have the intention to do something, but that nature will sometimes thwart them. And I think that's part of the role that Pearl plays, and she's very much linked to that.
Yeah.
But I think that the pagan thing also sort of drifts out even further into the book with the role of women in general in that, and the fact that there's sort of hints of witchcraft, which obviously
which I really liked.
In 17th century New England, you've got the other Crucible era kind of the witchcraft, the witch trials and things like that go on.
I can't remember. Was this set in Boston? But the did you read the Custom House? That's set in Salem, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think that there are definitely
there's a different link there
links to that. And is it the magistrate's wife? Is if not strongly hinted, is almost defined as being a witch.
Oh, it's very clearly said that she is the witch character, and it's almost presented that was Hester's other option, was that she could go and become this kind of witch-like figure.
And I think this precedes the events in Salem, doesn't it? Although, Hawthorne, writing in the mid-19th century, may have been sort of laying groundwork for what came later. in terms of the trials.
One of the other things about this book that really reminded me of Silas Marner was that kind of element of witchcraft. Silas Marner doesn't like go out and say and sort of mention witchcraft quite so much, but the atmosphere that's built up around the kind of the forested areas that these books are set in. So in Silas Marner you have Silas living in his cottage at the edge of the wood, having been ostracised from society, and eventually he has this small child that reconnects him with society, and his weaving, his work is what defines him. And I saw that being quite similar to Hester, who is living in her cottage at the edge of the wood, like, so again slightly distant from the town, with her small child who is almost like a thorn to society, but and her embroidery becomes what defines her and gives her a new role following her.
Well, they both live on the margin, don't they, of society, and they both have special powers. They both have things that are sought after by their community, but also slightly feared. So this idea of creativity, I think, is something which is important.
I think Silas Marner, other people in Raveloe, think that he is a witch because he has some kind of he has some healing knowledge, which is then seen as being like a witch-like healing knowledge, whereas Hester takes on this role of kind of like she goes and watches over people when they're dying and things like that, where
she's almost like a conscience in a way, isn't she? She's almost like almost a counselling role that she has, something that people can project their bad bits onto, so she becomes almost like
the town conscience,
or where people can place their bad things. I'm not sure if that's the same with Silas Marner, because it's a while since I read that. It's always useful for societies or communities to have an outsider that can take the blame and also explain things that you can't explain in another way, I think.
Yeah, and Silas and Hester, they both go through that process of being the one that's on the edge, who gradually comes to be a representative of, due to their very position on the edge, they gradually come to be almost central. So it talks about in this how Hester becomes somebody who, like, they see the A on her breast as representing angel after it's been a certain length of time, because she is separate from them but still like a caring figure to them, and the same happens with Silas after he takes in the child.
I think they both give their communities something that the communities need.
Yeah, they fill a gap.
They fill a gap, and they are, almost grudgingly accepted, and then there is a crisis where something happens and that rejection becomes a real thing again. But they resolve it, I think, on their own terms. Although Silas Marner, there's a bit of look, there's a body in the pond that we didn't know was there.
Yes, at the end. Spoilers for Silas Marner as well, guys. I found that very, very, very obvious, that twist in Silas Marner. But delightful.
What, someone's wandered off and never been seen again?
Next to a huge pond. Well, but moving away from Silas Marner again, because much as I loved Silas Marner, this was... We're supposed to be talking about the Scarlet Letter.
I think we've been talking about the Scarlet Letter.
We have, yeah. What did you think of the Custom House?
To be honest with you, I read about a third of it and then skipped to the start of the actual story because I just found it too... I thought if it's all going to be like that, I need to see the actual story starting. I thought if it's all going to be like this, then I'm not going to get on with it. That's
exactly what I had. So I read the first couple of pages of the Custom House and I was like, if the whole book is the Custom House, then I can't do it. So I skipped to the start of the Scarlet Letter just to compare, and I found the Scarlet Letter so engrossing and absorbing that I read the whole of it, and then I was like, oh, I never finished the Custom House. So after finishing the Scarlet Letter, I went back to the Custom House.
Maybe I should do that.
Yeah, and I found it a lot more interesting when I went back to it, because, I mean, there's a multitude of writing about what the Custom House means, but there's bits in it that you can definitely see as being written to correspond directly to the Scarlet Letter and to reflect directly on the Scarlet Letter, and there's all of these kind of old gentleman Custom House officer figures that reminded me in a way of the men who were in charge of the town and Hester's punishment and things like that. This kind of idea of like the leadership of a bunch of old men.
Yeah, I suppose that's about time passing, isn't it? About what seems important to one generation seems less important to another.
Yeah.
And that time changes and technology changes, so things get superseded.
Yeah.
And people have to deal with things in a different way.
And in the Custom House, Hawthorne talks about how entrenched he is in his town and how generations and generations of his family have lived there, and how like almost like the dust of the town must be related to him because so many of his relatives have been buried in the town, if that makes sense. And then he goes on to write this story about before all of that, before people had that like solid connection to the land. And yet Hester is still somehow kind of tied to this place, even though she wasn't born there.
I think a lot of it's about a new nation, isn't it? A new country creating its own mythology as it goes along. I think that's a part of it right from the start. And I suppose any nation has its things that go into its mythology, and but when you're starting something from scratch, when he was writing, in the 1850s, there were still huge chunks of America that were largely unexplored.
Wilderness, and the idea of being on the frontier and being involved in sort of forming a society was still quite relevant, I suppose.
And the literature is part of that, and I think that Hawthorne and Melville and the other people, Thoreau, people like that, very much had this idea that they were creating a literature for a new nation, a new country.
And what should American literature be?
And as you sort of said, in contrast to the old world. And I think that's one of the things that this book, one of the purposes it serves.
It's interesting that you say that, actually, because in these essays there was a lot about how, like, what constitutes an American story, and people would apparently draw quite a lot on the works of Hawthorne to try to define what makes an American story as opposed to just any other English language story, and trying to kind of distill essential characteristics of American literature, which I sometimes don't think it is strictly possible, particularly at this early stage where I don't know.
It is one of the things I struggle with some American writing, particularly by male American writers, is there seems to be this quest to continually write the great American novel, capitalised.
As opposed to just trying to write
a story, yes. And I think that, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century and the 21st century, there's been a stream of writings which have been sort of self-important in that regard, which I find quite tedious in many ways. I've never got on with people like Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, except in very marginal ways, because they just seem to be too full of themselves. Say, hey, look at me, I'm a serious writer.
Can't pretend to have ever read any of them, so...
and yes, what they do is obviously good and very worthy and got a lot of themes in it, but it just seems too deliberate, if you know what I mean.
Calculated.
It's a calculated thing. And I think that's one of the advantages that Hawthorne had, that maybe he was setting out to write a great American novel as a way of creating that literature, but not wanting to be part of a canon.
Well, actually, talking about this idea of the great American novel, he didn't consider The Scarlet Letter to be a novel. He draws a distinction in The Custom House and in other of his more kind of non-fiction-y writing between a novel and a romance, and this is a romance. Not in the sense of boy meets girl, although there is a degree of that in here, but in the sense of basically, if you write a novel, it should be like directly related to things that could actually happen, whereas if you write a romance, you're not constrained by the borders of reality, and you're allowed to put in things like The Scarlet Letter has plenty of, such as fate, such as the meteor that comes flying through the sky and makes the shape of a letter A, like you're allowed. But that's what I mean, like by writing a romance, he gives himself permission to create these sort of mad aspects of the plot without it having to be realistic according to his definition of the romance.
Well, again, that's a fairly common view, I think. I'd say fairly common view. I've got one example. Graham Greene used to talk about writing entertainments and novels, and maybe he got that from Hawthorne or other writers. This idea that you write things which people can read just purely for the sake of entertainment, and then you write something which has got a more serious moral or whatever political point to make.
Thinking also into British literature of a little bit earlier, but say Jane Austen wrote novels, so they are stories that maybe not entirely realistic, but they could happen. But some of her contemporaries wrote romances, so like The Romance of the Forest or The Mysteries of Udolpho, which are definitely not constrained by the boundaries of what is likely. They're all full of like bizarre coincidences and castles and things like that. So I suppose that is a distinction between a romance and a novel.
You're talking about an area that I'm not particularly familiar with.
It's fine, you don't have to be. I'm just saying that this distinction between the novel and the romance already existed in British literature, and Hawthorne took that over to the States. Perhaps, potentially.
Yeah. Well, it's about whether it's worthy or whether it's frivolous, isn't it?
Or I suppose it's about, it doesn't have to be literally accurate for it to make an important emotional point.
Well, that's the same with all fiction, isn't it? It's about good fiction will make you think, It will make you have discussions like this about not only what the book means, but what it means in a wider cultural and social sense, I think. And, what do books tell us about anything?
Yeah,
They don't
and
tell
the
us about
societies that we have.
ourselves.
Yeah. So we should probably wrap it up because we've got a decent amount of I don't know.
We've done talking about
We've talked about stuff, and now we need to end the talking about stuff.
Yeah, and get on with Christmas, really.
Yeah,
it's getting dark, so it's obviously time to start drinking.
So yeah, we've spent like the last 2 days doing lots and lots of Christmas baking because that's what this house is all about.
There have been videos elsewhere on the YouTube
of Christmas baking in this household.
Of baking going on.
But I'd imagine I won't post this till January. So Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
And how did you like the Scarlet Letter? Concluding thoughts on the Scarlet Letter? Good book, bad book, medium book?
I think it's obviously any book that's still in print 200 years after it was written, or 180 odd years after it was written, it's got something going for it, and I think it's a good book. Obviously, it's a good book.
I really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't put it in my top books of the year.
No, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for watching. Thanks, Steve, for participating.
Well, thank you for asking me.
I just need one with me and Minerva now. I don't think she's going to have any particularly insightful comments to make. She might mule slightly.
Bye.
Goodbye.